Zoom doesn't provide Ukrainian as official language. So if you look in your Zoom table, Zoom screen, you will see Korean. So Korean, it means Ukrainian. So yeah, so if you want to listen in Ukrainian, there is such an option. So I'm very much pleased and honored to host this discussion with Madame Jourova. We met once back in September 2015 when Vice President at that time was European Commissioner, still very important position. Vera Jourova was in charge for justice, consumers and gender equalities. And I remember we discussed at that time the importance of anti-corruption reform in Ukraine, the importance of the judicial reform. Both reforms are still very important. However, there is something was done, something was something we still are lacking. But Ukraine is striving for the European values. And Ukrainians value also transparency. And these are two things Madame Jourova is in charge for. We in Ukraine are striving for the rule of law, and we value EU for its kind of the best practice of the rule of law. And it's the biggest asset of the European Union, but some autocratic regimes think that it is probably the biggest weakness and are trying to attack that. So I will give now the floor to Madame Jourova, Vice President. We in Ukraine are very much willing to transform our country to be closer to the family of the European Union. And we are thankful for the support which they do. How do you see Ukraine from Brussels, and is it still in the attention of the European Commission? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daria, and thank you for refreshing my memory on my visit to Ukraine in 2015. I remember it very well. And I promised to come back soon, and it didn't happen yet. And I am rather frustrated because I already planned to go to Ukraine last year at the end of my previous mandate. And then, you know, it was very messy, and the start of the new commission and my new mandate. And now I wanted to come also this spring. And simply, I hope we can meet soon in person. And let's be grateful for the possibilities of sharing the views and having good communication through the virtual methods. So I have two main messages today: that Ukraine is a key partner for the EU, and that continuation of judicial and anti-corruption reforms are of utmost importance. So this remains the same since I was there in 2015. Both reforms, judicial and anti-corruption, are important for the EU-Ukraine relationship. And above all, they are important for Ukrainian citizens who want to live in a modern, democratic and European country. The reforms in Ukraine since 2014 have been unprecedented, and so has the EU support been very big. I here speak about 15 billion euro mobilized in support of Ukraine since 2014. And there was always a clear emphasis accompanying this financial support, the emphasis on strengthening Ukraine's resilience. Without a resilient Ukraine, there cannot be a resilient Europe. Resilience requires genuine, sustainable reforms. And we do want to work together with Ukraine on the full implementation on association agreement, deep and comprehensive free trade area, to make sure all its benefits are realized for the citizens. And the EU also continues to assist Ukraine with structural reforms and institution building, for example, our successful EU anti-corruption initiatives. And the EU also stands in full solidarity with Ukraine's efforts to fight the COVID-19 pandemic. I think I should have started with this strong message that we stand strongly with Ukrainian people, and we wish you to get out of the crisis in good shape, good health, and with good also economic perspective, which is a big challenge now also for all EU countries. In the context of this COVID-19 pandemic, the EU has quickly mobilized a package of 190 million euro. And this money should be used to support the health sector and emergency needs, address the economic and social consequences of the pandemic, and support the most vulnerable groups of citizens. As part of the COVID crisis response, the EU also decided to make available a further exceptional macro-financial assistance program for Ukraine up to 1.2 billion euro, for which policy conditions are being negotiated now with Ukraine. And the EU will include conditions relating to rule of law and anti-corruption reforms. It is essential for Ukraine to stay on the reform path, especially concerning the rule of law and anti-corruption. The COVID-19 crisis must not become an excuse for backtracking on reform achievements or giving in to oligarchic interests. Let me say a few words in general about the reforms. Since the evolution of dignity 6 years ago, Ukraine has made unprecedented progress in reforming the country. It is important that the government continues implementing an ambitious reform program to make it irreversible and sustainable. I welcome President Zelensky's leadership in striving to fulfill the prior actions for the International Monetary Fund program. This allowed also the EU to disburse the outstanding 500 million tranche of its current macro-financial assistance program. And I've been given an information that a representative of the IMF will explain details during the panel debate. Is it true? So I will ask my colleagues to inform me about the information received from IMF today. I also want to stress the importance of continuing rule of law reforms in Ukraine. As I already said at the beginning, the rule of law has a direct impact on the life of every citizen. It is a precondition for ensuring equal treatment before the law, for preventing abuse of power by public authorities, and for decision makers to be held accountable. Respect for rule of law is essential to ensure public trust in state institutions. It is also crucial to sustain economic growth, create a transparent level playing field, and improve the business and investment climate in Ukraine. Fight against corruption and the undue influence on vested interests in media, economics, and politics is an essential element of strengthening the rule of law. Let me highlight the key role of civil society and independent media in this context. It is so important that civil society organizations and journalists can do their work without fear of violence or intimidation. The EU is not only expecting Ukraine to carry out rule of law reforms, but it is also working on strengthening the rule of law within the Union and its member states. The Commission is setting up a comprehensive European rule of law mechanism covering all member states with objective annual reporting by the European Commission. The report will cover the justice systems, the fight against corruption, media pluralism, and other institutional issues relating to checks and balances. So you see, we are focusing a lot on our member states to do our homeworks at home. And this rule of law report, the first edition, will be announced in September this year. So now on the reform of the judiciary, one of Ukraine's success stories, I'm sure about it, is the launch of the High Anti-Corruption Court in September 2019. this court is expected to deliver convictions in high-level corruption cases. It is now important to ensure the independence of the court, including through adequate budgetary resources and permanent buildings. I remember in 2015, there were a lot of doubts whether this will come true and whether there will be a strong enough institution to go after the corruption cases where big political and economic interests and people will be involved. So I must say, I see this as really a very, very good progress. I also welcome the intention to complete the judicial reform announced when President Zelensky took office last May. However, I am concerned that the reform has been blocked for many months now. This is problematic because it has not been possible since last September to recruit new judges to fill the more than 2,000 vacancies in the country. It is indispensable to unblock the reform as soon as possible. Without the capacities, without the knowledgeable people, without the judges, without the professional judges who will fulfill all the very demanding conditions of professionalism, of moral integrity, and of high qualification, the justice reform cannot work in Ukraine. You cannot do that without the qualified people. So again, we need to see a reform law proposed and adopted which introduces amendments in accordance with the Constitution of Ukraine and also in accordance with the Venice Commission recommendations. I guess also on this you will have a debate with the representative of the Venice Commission. The adoption of judicial reform legislation is of such fundamental importance that both the IMF and the EU have made it a condition under their respective memoranda of understanding, as you know very well. In order to achieve the sustainable judicial reform, it is important to not only ensure the principle of judicial independence and the security of judicial tenure, but also the integrity of the judicial corps. This requires a reform of the judicial governance bodies responsible for selecting, appointing, and disciplining judges. Namely, here I speak about the High Council of Justice. So on the justice reform, I will try to finalize my part on this positively, that the EU will continue providing support to the reform of the judiciary in Ukraine. Also, I think it's right to say a few words about the fight against corruption. The continuous fulfillment of the anti-corruption benchmarks was key in the decision to grant visa-free access to the EU to Ukrainian citizens. Therefore, the progress in Ukraine is closely monitored and reported by the Commission in the framework of the visa suspension mechanism's regular reporting. There have been positive developments, such as the start of work of the High Anti-Corruption Court, recriminalization of illicit enrichment, and granting the National Anti-Corruption Bureau the right of independent wiretapping. But I am concerned regarding the increased politicization of the work of anti-corruption institutions. It is essential to preserve the independence and effective functioning of all of the anti-corruption agencies. This also includes ensuring competitive and merit-based selection procedures conducted by a depoliticized selection commission for management positions in anti-corruption institutions and strong safeguards for their independence. Dismissal of the leadership of anti-corruption institutions should occur only in accordance with the current legislation. In this context, let me express my concern regarding reports of possible changes of the leadership in the National Anti-Corruption Bureau. I appreciate the progress toward the effective and automated verification of electronic asset declarations, notably granting the National Agency for Corruption Prevention access to all relevant registries and databases. At the same time, I'd like to express EU concern about frequent changes to the legal framework on e-declarations that are introduced without sufficient analysis and consultation with relevant authorities. I also want to reiterate that the EU stands ready to provide the necessary assistance for Ukraine in the area of anti-corruption. Last but not least, let me stress again the importance of involving civil society experts and academia and ensuring the greatest possible transparency about the reforms. This is crucial for genuine reforms that can strengthen citizens' trust in the institutions that are supposed to serve them. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention, and I am informed that there might be some follow-up debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice President. It's a very informative speech. Thank you for all your support. On the right of the moderator, I will ask first question, and then I encourage both the panelists and participants to ask their questions. You can raise your hand or you can write it to all panelists. Vice President, you mentioned about visa liberalization action plan. And for us, for civil society, it was a powerful leverage and a powerful tool to convince our Ukrainian politicians to do reforms, especially anti-corruption reforms, which are painful for politicians. We are happy that we are now visa-free with the EU, and we hope that after pandemic, our borders will be reopened. But what kind of leverage EU has after visa liberalization action plan? Can we say that macro-financial assistance is also linked to very specific anti-corruption and the rule of law conditionalities? I think you mentioned briefly about that. It seems that they're still under the consultations. Can we hope that there will be very precise commitments? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, you said that it's a powerful leverage from the point of view of civil society. It's the same from the point of view of the EU. So, of course, this is a very strong signal for the EU that also there is sufficient trust for Ukraine or vis-a-vis Ukraine, that the reforms will continue, that they will be irreversible, as I said, and that the conditions which were set up for the visa liberalization will be taken seriously and will be fulfilled. So this is ongoing. I mean the trust, and we also trust that we will see soon Ukrainian people again coming to EU countries. If I may be a little bit personal, we are missing your nurses. And many people who are used to go to work to Czechia, because this is always so nice. And here I'm very personal. When I see Ukrainian people working in the services and being so able to adapt to our conditions and to adapt to the language, and for me also it's a personal case that I would be happy if this is possible again after COVID pandemic. You asked about the conditions. Well, it is a stable condition. The ongoing judicial reforms and ongoing steps to increase the fight against corruption. These are the conditions both for IMF and for the EU. So there is a permanent monitoring. I am not directly involved in it. So I tried to be concrete. So the concrete messages I gave to you a minute ago were provided to me by the experts who are whose everyday job is to be in contact with Ukrainian authorities and monitor the situation in the country. But these conditions remain. Judicial reform and anti-corruption reforms and measures to be taken. No backtracking, because it's always a signal of something politically, first of all, very how to say, worrying. I truly believe that the reforms are not only needed to keep the visa liberalization in place and to have the opportunity to get the money from the international organizations and from the EU. But also it's important for Ukrainian people to see that something is happening and something is going in the right direction. And I remember in 2015, when I was there, I spoke to NGOs, to media, to many people from, not necessarily from the state authorities, who expressed the hope that the institutions will reform in the way that the trust of the people will increase, and that the frustration of the citizens that nothing is happening and nothing is improving will go down. The trust of people is needed, because when you look at the judiciary sphere, when in a country, the trust of people to judiciary system is between 10 to 30%, how do you think it's dangerous for the government to attack judiciary? It's easy. The governments do not risk anything because the people are not with judiciary. They are not supporting judiciary with the trust. And so there is a green light for such governments who have appetite to limit the powers of this referee. I call the judges sometimes referees, who are needed in this democratic society. So for such government, it is easy to attack judiciary and to disbalance the constitutional powers, and the people will not have any say. So the trust is important to increase. Sorry, I got somewhere else, but I always want to stress this interaction with the citizens, that the reforms must not be only a theoretical thing or artificial thing, so that to please Brussels or whoever.
Absolutely, I fully agree with you. I want to ask our attendees and panelists whether they have any questions. If not, I have many. So, and I think Vice President still has some minutes to spend with us. So, attendees, Tatiana, can you help me? There is somebody showing hand. Who is that showing hand? Mark, you are online with us.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, can you
say
who you are?
Yes, let me introduce myself maybe first. I'm Mark de Mesmaker. I'm a Belgian MP, National Parliament. I used to be a member of the European Parliament in the last mandate. And I was, well, member of the delegation for Ukraine, parliamentary delegation, and also vice president of the friendship group, Friends of European Ukraine. So I've been following up on the events in Ukraine, and I still do now as a member of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly and a local friendship group. I've visited Ukraine several times, also during Euromaidan protests, and that's where it all began, of course. And I very well know that indeed what we've been talking about here, the fight against corruption, is a cornerstone of the reforms that also the people have asked for and have died for. And it is also a condition to eradicate corruption in Ukraine, to be able to attract investors, to put the country on a track to boost the economy, to boost the real competition in the economy, to create welfare for the people. Now, my questions, because I've not been following up very, let's say, the last period since the new president and the new majority has been formed in the Verkhovna Rada. Do you have?
Yes. A quick more question, please, because we have.
Yes. Do you have the impression that there is a different approach now, since the new president has taken office and there is a new majority in the Verkhovna Rada? And I ask this question because we now see, well, some new disturbing evolutions, like the persecution of a former president, that remind us of former events in the history, the recent history of Ukraine. And the second question is about the position of the head of the Anti-Corruption Bureau, which in my eyes has done an enormous good job. But Mr. Chyzhyk, to be precise, has been under hostile fire a couple of times. What is his position for the moment? And then a third question about indeed the independence of this anti-corruption court. It has taken a long time before it was installed. It is there now, but still, what can we say and can we be sure about the independence of this court in a country where political and business interests are often intermixed and strangled, and where oligarchs often pull the strings and have pulled the strings and still pull the strings in society? Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I think some of your questions will be able, other panelists will be able to respond later, but I'm giving now the floor to Madame Jourova. You can pick up any of them.
Yes, thank you very much. So to compare the previous government and now in Mr. Zelensky's era, it's not easy for me to say, because I was personally in Ukraine and I spoke to the authorities, and I heard a lot of pro-reform rhetorics, a lot of promises and a lot of big plans. I spoke to President Poroshenko. I have it very fresh in my memory, because I remember I upset him by having a lot of uncomfortable questions. But what I hear now, also very pro-reform declarations and promises already in the campaign of Mr. President Zelensky were very promising. But there is plenty of work still to be done, especially to unblock the judicial reform is important to do, because this is not only for big rule of law, for the sake of rule of law principle, but for the sake of mere functioning of judiciary in the country. I spoke about the lack of judges and about the need to have the functional system in the country. So hard to compare the previous and the current political authorities. At least from what I hear in official talks, there is a lot of determination to move. What is the position on the head of Anti-Corruption Bureau? Well, I understand from the information I received from the colleagues that there are concerns about the plans to change the person in this position. And I don't know the concrete. I don't know the man, the head personally, but whenever you decide to change the person in such a position, you need to have a strong legal reason. You need to have a very strong legal case and legal ground and evidence, and this must not be easy, if I can say it bluntly, to get rid of the person in such position. Yeah, because there are very high demands on these people being in these positions, which require professionalism and courage to do the job. There are high demands, and the people are the people are expected to do in a very professional way their job. So they need to have also relevant safeguards in the system. Yeah. So if in the system you see that it's easy to get rid of the head of anti-corruption body, then there is something wrong in the system. Yeah. So, but we express the concerns, and I cannot say more on that. On independence of anti-corruption court, well, again, this is about the parameters. There must be very clearly determined the selection and application processes, the guarantees, which I have just spoken about, the way to discipline the people and to dismiss the people. And again, here, the parameter that these people working in these bodies must not be so easy to liquidate. Sorry for using this word. It is the principle which has to be enshrined in the legislation.
Thank you, Vice President. And one more question from me. You talked about trust, and judiciary in Ukraine has very low trust of Ukrainian citizens. But there are a few social polls in Ukraine that Ukrainian citizens actually trust civil society and foreigners in the case of selecting judges and in vetting judicial bodies. However, in Ukraine, there are different forces, sometimes backed up by our neighbors. And I'm talking about the authoritative state, which is Russia, which are using strategic corruption. The various tools to spread distrust in Ukraine to civil society, to foreign experts, to spread messages using their TV channels about the Western, I don't know, Soros or European values of LGBT and other stuff. And these strategic corruption tools are being also used to destroy and destabilize the European Union. You mentioned today that you are focusing a lot on the strengthening EU institutions in the EU member states. So my question goes here to you, actually, how are you dealing with this strategic corruption which is used by foreign states against the joint European Union project? And how do you assess the experience of Ukraine in using foreign experts, including the European Union, the EU member state experts in vetting judges of the High Anti-Corruption Court? This is the success story which you mentioned. Thank you.
Can you repeat the second question on the vetting of judges?
How do you assess this Ukrainian approach, which we developed through High Anti-Corruption Court establishment, where foreign experts and foreign actually judges, former judges, had crucial role in banning bad candidates from entering High Anti-Corruption Court? In civil society, we believe that it was actually the core to the success story to the High Anti-Corruption Court, which you mentioned.
I will first reply on the second. I think that the support and help from the like-minded partners, which is EU, from friendly side, might be very useful. But I am afraid that the main things must be done by domestic personalities, domestic institutions, maybe with the advice of the experts from outside. You know that the EU has always been ready to provide the expert help and to support the teams of experts combined from domestic experts and the external experts from the EU countries. So this can continue. However, when I was in Ukraine in 2015, I remember I wanted to speak to all institutions which deal with which do some advisory work and some expert work. And there were, I think, 13, 14 different projects. And they were doing more or less the same thing. So I saw a lack of coordination or a lack of mutual understanding of who is doing what. But I know I'm not replying your question on the foreign experts. So involved in the vetting and selection procedures. So yes, but I believe that it should be mainly the process which is run by trustworthy Ukrainian strong figures who can guarantee the success. But it's my personal opinion. I am not involved in this and I don't know the details of the process. So I hope I'm not now destroying the EU doctrine. I think that it should be done with the main interest to achieve the best possible result. And the second, I don't know if we speak here about strategic corruption efforts from outside. We are going to make stricter the rules for financing of political parties, because there were cases of financial support which was very disputable. What is paid by the money, whether it is not the bad influence which is somehow imported onto a European territory. And the second thing, so this is planned to adopt a legislation which will come with more transparent rules for financing of political parties, especially when it comes to foreign financing. And the second thing, which is maybe closer to what you asked about, we have just adopted the action plan against disinformation in the context of COVID crisis. And here we named very clearly Russia as one of the main producers of the subverting messages and the disinformation campaigns, which aim is simply to distract our society, to undermine the unity of the EU, to undermine the trust of the people in their institutions, that the democratic EU institutions can manage the COVID crisis, and we needed to act against that. So if you are interested in it, you can look at into our action plan, which counts with a very big cooperation between the Commission, member states, platforms such as Facebook and Google, fact checkers, because we have to defend the truth by delivering the facts. Yeah, in Europe, we are not fighting foreign propaganda by our propaganda. We are fighting against this with the facts and arguments. And also we want to increase the conditions for, or improve the conditions for the independent journalism and for the journalists in general, because we need them to support and uphold democracies in EU. Sorry, I was too long again.
It was very helpful. Thank you very much, Madam Jourova. We really believe in Ukraine that we have very well-skilled professionals to save Ukraine, but it is important to have proper selection procedures to ensure that they have chances to get on the top positions. And this is the discussion which we will now continue in more details, how to make sure the best of the best judges will enter the judicial system, and how to ensure that those judges which were ensuring police abusing their power during revolution of dignity, how to ensure that those judges which were issuing decisions allowing embezzlement of billions of dollars are flooding Ukraine. So how to ensure they quit the system? It's our key puzzle now. So thank you, Vice President. We are waiting forward to see you offline after the pandemic in Ukraine to continue this discussion. I hope we will already have some progress on the issues which we discussed. We value very much the EU support, and we have role models still to follow for Ukrainian people. It is important. So
thank you. I wish you all the best. Good luck to Ukrainian people in the COVID and everything. And I hope to be able to come, if you invite me, to Ukraine soon to help maybe somehow the reform efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah, and now we will continue discussing more details the judicial reform. I will pass the floor to my colleague Halyna Chyzhyk, who is a judicial expert at Anti-Corruption Action Center. We have the very bright panel. We have representative of Minister of Justice, Oleksandr Banchuk. As I understand, unfortunately, Minister is still busy at the Constitutional Court hearing. We have Thomas Markert, the Secretary of the Venice Commission. We have Emmanuel Mathias from the IMF. And we have Mykhailo Zhernakov from DEJURE Foundation. We hoped to have Mr. Kostin, the head of the Legal Affairs Committee. Probably he will join. We don't have the response from him now, but Halyna, floor is yours, and I'm disappearing now.
Thank you, Daria, and a lot of thanks to Madam Jourova for such strong messages she gave. So how to achieve successful judicial reform in Ukraine? We will try to find the answer for this question for the rest an hour and 20 minutes we have. And as Daria has already introduced our prominent speakers, but before I'll start the discussion, I want to make a brief introduction of where we are with our judicial reform right now. Unfortunately, 6 years after the Revolution of Dignity, Ukrainians still have to go to protest for fair trial. Because despite numerous attempts aimed at reforming judiciary that had been made during 2015-2019, judiciary remains the least trusted public institution in Ukraine, and only Russian media has the lower level of support. And all measures that were taken in order to change the situation, like creating a new Supreme Court from scratch, adopting a law that envisages that all judges have to undergo qualification evaluation of their integrity, amending the constitution with the provision saying that judges who cannot prove the legality of their assets have to be dismissed. All these measures have not led to qualitative renewal of judiciary, as the most corrupt and the most notorious judges who took politically motivated decisions, judges possessing assets they cannot explain, they all not only remain seated, but a lot of them were promoted to the Supreme Court or Judicial Council. And the responsibility for the failure to cleanse and renew judiciary lies with the main bodies entrusted with the appointment and dismissal of judges. These are the High Council of Justice and the High Qualification Commission of Judges. In autumn 2019, Ukrainian parliament, under the initiative of the President Zelensky, adopted a new law that envisaged the reboot of the High Qualification Commission of Judges and cleaning of the High Council of Justice from tainted members. And what is more important, the law engaged well-reputable international experts to the process of selecting new members of Judicial Commission and scrutiny of members of the High Council of Justice. But the implementation of the law was sabotaged by the High Council of Justice, which refused to create an independent panel tasked with integrity checks on the HCJ, High Council of Justice members. And furthermore, the High Council of Justice adopted illegal rules of provisions for the competition for the Judicial Commission. So here we are now. The reform is blocked. The High Council of Justice covers up corrupt judges and persecute independent ones. There are numerous cases of dishonest behavior of the members of the High Council of Justice, and with colleagues from the DEJURE Foundation and after Maidan, we even created an online database of the failure of the High Council of Justice. At the same time, Ukrainians almost a daily basis go to protest for fair justice. So we understand that judicial reform needs to be finally done in Ukraine. It needs to be successful. But what we have to do in order to establish a fair trial and the public confidence in judiciary, and most importantly, how this should be done. So let's find the answers to these questions. And Before I give the floor to our speaker, I want just to remind that the time limit for speeches is 5 up to 7 minutes. So dear speakers, I will keep track of time and remind you of the time limits. And after your speeches, we will have a small questions and answers session. So my first question is to Oleksandr Banchuk, Deputy Minister of Justice. Oleksandr, are you with us? Yes. So, Oleksandr, what should we do to achieve judicial reform? And when Ukrainians will receive justice, what is the government's plan, and how are you expecting to achieve this? Oleksandr? Yes. So we see you, and Oleksandr, I'm sorry, we don't hear you. I'm sorry. Some troubles. Maybe you have your earphones connected to your computer. Can you say something again? Unfortunately, we have troubles with the connection. So while we are trying to fix this with Oleksandr, I will give the floor to our to another speaker. We are very lucky to have here Venice Commission Secretary and IMF representative. Oleksandr, are you with us? We hear you, but the sound is very low. Okay, so we'll try to fix it, but I think that we have another speaker who can answer the questions I asked Oleksandr, and this is Mykhailo Zhernakov, who is one of the key experts on judiciary reform in Ukraine, and my colleague from the Public Integrity Council. So Mykhailo, you have been monitoring judicial reforms in Ukraine.
Я вас прекрасно. Це нормально, я не знаю, чому нічому не чути.
So, maybe we should give last try with Oleksandr. We hear you. Are you with us? No, again. Oleksandr, just please say something if there are still troubles, and we will talk with Mykhailo on the issue. Okay. We'll try it later, maybe. So, Mykhailo, what needs to be done in order to achieve successful judicial reform in Ukraine?
Thank you very much, Halyna. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm happy. Well, thank you first of all for this invitation. It is a very it's a great honor and a great pleasure to be speaking here today. Thank you, AntAC, for organizing this. I'll try to be brief. Of course, it's a very vast question, and I can be talking about this for hours, maybe. We don't have this time. I remember what is the cap. So basically, I just like to reflect on a couple of things that also Madam Jourova mentioned. First of all, we're talking about the lack of judges here in Ukraine. It is a problem, but it's not, by far, it is not the biggest problem in Ukraine's judiciary, because it is really integrity of the judiciary and not the number of the judges in Ukraine. Yes, there is a lack of judges, but we have to remember why it is there. It was the response of the judiciary for the judicial reform that was introduced right after the Revolution of Dignity, where they had to undergo the qualification assessment or reattestation, where we had to look into their integrity and professionalism. And then about 2,000 judges retired voluntarily. So probably these are the judges that did not want to be seen in this reform. And if the system stays the same, if we only fix the problem of the number of judges, we will continue to have the same problems with the integrity, because if we keep the same High Council of Justice in place, then we'll have the same quality of the judges, and whatever is the number, people will not get justice. We can hire 2,000 more judges, 3,000 more judges, but it's not the quality, it's the quantity, not the quantity, but the quality of the judges that we're really interested in. So how do we do this? It is no secret that our organizations, civil society organizations, introduced the Judicial Reform Map, something that we just recently produced in a response to the crisis of the judicial reform in Ukraine, and let's be honest, the very limited, let's say so, ability of the current government to produce any strategic vision for the judicial reform here in Ukraine. Obviously, if the biggest problem is integrity of the judges, we have to continue cleansing the judiciary, and it is the #1 priority. For that, we had to reboot the judicial governance bodies. First of all, the High Council of Justice, a very problematic judicial governance body that Halyna already mentioned, and of course the High Qualification Commission of Judges that's responsible for prior judicial selection. And for that, would have to also introduce the new way of selection of these people that will bring us members of these commissions of high integrity and high professionalism, so they can then bring it on and continue the same way with the rest of the judiciary. Now, how do we do this? I already shared my thoughts in the chat, trying to a little bit challenge of what was said before. In no way we're trying to shift the responsibility of developing and implementing judicial reforms. Obviously, we, the people of Ukraine, are responsible for our own future, and there's no discussion about this. But what we found in the practice, in a very vast practice of judicial selection here in Ukraine, that only including independent international experts into the system of judicial selection works in terms of judicial reform, in terms of creating new judicial institutions. It was already mentioned the very good experience of creation of the High Anti-Corruption Court, where we had this system in place, where compared to all the judicial selections that we had before, 0 judges were selected that had severe reservations from the civil society about their integrity or their professionalism. And that is only due to the inclusion and the participation of the Public Council of International Experts, of very reputable judges and prosecutors from EU countries, from Canada and from other, and now I should say England, which is now a non-EU country, that helped us really select a very good composition of the High Anti-Corruption Court that is now producing the first outstanding results that we never have seen before. And let me stress it once again, the selection of these, the selection system and the selection procedure, it was day and night compared to what we had before, including that was unfortunately of the selection of the Supreme Court that we had before, where unfortunately at least 44 members of the Supreme Court had a negative review of the Public Integrity Council because of their integrity issues, property issues, human rights abuse, and other things. And here I would like to emphasize on 2 more things before I finish. One, it is very important to borrow the relevant international experience, but would also have to be cautious about, would rather borrow your expertise and your experts, at least for the time being, before we cleanse our own judiciary, because it is not at the moment capable of governing itself. And here I'd have to very severely criticize one provision that is very popular among European countries, that the judicial governance bodies should have the majority of judges elected by their peers, so by the judges of the country. We have tried that for several years, at least since 2016, and it failed miserably. The High Council of Justice, the very notorious body that we're talking about right now, consists by the majority of the judges elected by the judges. And what it is doing, it is prosecuting independent judges systematically. It is greenlighting the notorious judges that are still the Maidan judges that prosecuted peaceful protesters during the Revolution of Dignity. It keeps other judges of law integrity in place. And the result is still the level of trust of the judiciary. It is at about 10 or 13% at the moment in Ukraine. So we already tried this and it doesn't work. But we already tried inclusion of the independent international experts, and that works. So that is why we strongly believe that, at least for the time being, for the reform and for the effective judicial renewal, would have to include independent international experts with the decision-making power to at least exclude the members that or the competitors for the judicial position that do not have relevant integrity or professionalism. And last but not least, what I have to stress is that we already touched upon this about the conditionality of the international aid and international support. I have to say the support of the EU and the support of the IMF were instrumental in terms of achieving reforms, especially when it came to the creation of the High Anti-Corruption Court. There we had it as a strict conditionality with the IMF, and only because IMF was very persistent and very, should I say, strict with our authorities that did not want an independent international court, an independent anti-corruption court to be in place. Only because of that, we had a very good law and we had a very good judicial selection. And now we have a really good success story that we, many of us even would not believe that is achievable in the current political situation. So I'd really like to encourage the IMF and other international donors to really strictly condition international aid on the successful judicial reform and judicial selection, especially what is now already in the IMF memorandum, the renewal of the High Council of Justice. We should not only tick the boxes here, we should absolutely avoid this. We should really work together to achieve the effective renewal of the High Council of Justice. So it takes on then when it has good members of high integrity and high professionalism, and then finally brings us good judicial corps and rule of law in Ukraine. Thank you very much, and I'll be very happy. That is briefly what I wanted to say. I'll be very happy to answer your questions if you have those.
Thank you, Mykhailo. So to sum up your and Madam Jourova messages, it looks like the reform of the High Council of Justice, which is the main body in judicial system of Ukraine, is the top priority and precondition for ensuring the rule of law in Ukraine. And the answer to question how is international experts and civil society as a unique Ukrainian solution, they should be engaged to the process of cleaning and renewing judicial governance. And Mykhailo mentioned in his speech IMF. So why are we talking about IMF? Now I'd like to give the floor to the representative of International Monetary Fund, Mr. Emmanuel Mathias, who is Deputy Unit Chief in IMF. He works in legal department. So June 9, IMF Executive Board approved 18 months $5 billion standby arrangement for Ukraine. Among financial and fiscal indicators, the most important conditions include a commitment to the comprehensive judicial reform. In particular, Ukraine took a commitment to, and now I will cite the official document, to strengthen the selection and disciplinary processes for the judiciary consistent with European judicial standard. They will ensure Ukraine will ensure that the judicial governance officials that are responsible for and manage these processes, which is High Council of Justice and High Qualification Commission of Judges, are of high competence, trustworthiness, and integrity. Recent legislation on judicial reforms included the participation of experts with international experience, but it did not cover the selection process for the High Council of Justice. Thus, the authorities Ukrainian authorities will strengthen pre-selection process for High Council of Justice candidates to ensure that its members have impeccable reputation and integrity. Also, international experts will be engaged to the process of pre-selection of the members of the High Council of Justice, and they conduct a one-time screening of existing HCJ members on compliance with the criteria established by law, and then initiate a dismissal of those who do not meet criteria. So this is the commitment Ukraine took before the IMF. And there is a very strict deadline till the end of October 2020. The relevant legislation should have been implemented by Ukraine. And if not, that will mean that Ukraine won't be able to receive the next tranche from International Monetary Fund. So, Mr. Mathias, my first question to you is the following. IMF has been cooperating with Ukraine for quite a long period of time, but this is the first time IMF touches on issues relating to judicial reform. Why IMF cares for judicial reform? Did Mr. Kolomoisky, previous owner of Privatbank, or some district courts which took decisions in his favor contributed to that?
Hi all, and good evening to you who are in Kiev. Thank you for inviting us to participate in this panel. It's always a pleasure to be in Ukraine, even virtually. I had the chance to visit many times since actually 2014. And as you said, the IMF has been involved on Ukraine, actually working with the authorities since almost the independence, since the beginning of the 90s, and most particularly on issues related to anti-corruption after Maidan and the first subsequent program in 2014. And so it's right that the latest arrangement supported by the IMF that has been approved by our executive board earlier this month is the first time that there is some major focus on judicial reform. However, it's not the first time that we have been discussing judicial issues with the Ukrainian authorities, actually as part of the anti-corruption work. And as was mentioned earlier by Mykhailo, we have been working with the authorities on the establishment of the High Anti-Corruption Court. But to go back to your questions, it's an interesting one. Why is the IMF focusing on judicial reform in Ukraine? The IMF is not an institution focused on the judiciary, obviously. The main focus of the IMF includes economic stability, includes economic development. So why do we discuss these issues of judicial reform with the authorities? It's mostly because we have identified as an institution, and we have this in a document in 2018 on our governance framework, that there are pillars of government activity that have a significant macroeconomic impact, and one of these pillars is the rule of law. Because in the specific context of Ukraine, we have understood from our discussions with the civil society, with donors, with the business community, and with the authorities, that the public trust in the judiciary remains low and is perceived as hampering business development. And so that's why we became interested in that issue, because ultimately it's an issue that is critical for economic development. And one of the key areas we understood of public concern has been shortcomings in the judicial selection and disciplinary processes. And that explains the focus of the memorandum that you mentioned. And in addition, of course, if there is not a strong focus on sustaining an anti-corruption and judicial reform agenda, the power of the state to insulate resources from the control of vested interests may be weakened. So it's really important to us to have a robust judiciary, because it's a major factor of a functioning market economy, where the property rights are respected, where adverse behavior, acts of corruption are criminalized, prosecuted, adjudicated, and where the public and the investors have a trust in the system. So in this regard, the decision from the authorities as part of the discussions with the IMF staff to strengthen the selection and the disciplinary processes for the judiciary consistent with European judicial standards has been really much welcome. And our view is that this should help ensure that the judicial officials that are responsible for and that manage these processes are of high competence, are trustworthy, and display integrity.
Mr. Mathias, with regards to the reform of the High Council of Justice, what is your vision of the proper renewal of this body? As given the experience with the previous law that was adopted but never implemented because of the sabotage from the High Council of Justice, what would you consider as the successful implementation of this benchmark by Ukraine? And I cannot mention in this regard as yesterday the president submitted the draft law to the parliament. It is again a draft regarding judiciary, but instead of establishing an independent body for scrutiny the members of the High Council of Justice or conducting pre-selection to this body, the draft that was initiated by the president simply suggests that the members of the High Council of Justice themselves will decide whether to dismiss their peers or not. So what is your vision of the proper reform of the High Council of Justice? And have you seen this draft, and what is your take on it?
Yeah, thank you. No, I haven't analyzed this, and we haven't analyzed this draft yet. And in any event, as you mentioned earlier, the test date for the measure that the authorities agreed on is by end of October 2020. So we will have time to discuss with the authorities and understand their views and the implementation of their commitment. So what we will be looking at after the end of October 2020 is actually the role of the IMF staff is just to see if what the authorities committed in the memorandum that has been agreed recently is implemented. And the memorandum is very specific. And if you want, I can mention 5 pillars of what we would see as the successful implementation of the commitment. So it includes first that there is an independent commission that is established to pre-screen the potential candidates to the High Council of Justice and assess their integrity. So there should be also not only the existence of this commission, but this commission should be able to perform also one-off screening of existing High Council of Justice members. It will be important to see that at least half of the Commission's members will be respected experts with recognized ethical standards and judicial experience, including with relevant experience in other countries. And it will be important that the Commission will give to these experts a crucial and decisive vote in any decisions. Then what we will look also at is make sure that the law outlines the procedures and criteria for the pre-selection process for the High Council of Justice candidates, including a call by the Commission for applications, and that the Commission will then nominate at least 2 persons for each vacancy, which will be forwarded to the respective appointing authorities that are designated by the Constitution for final selection and approval. Finally, we will also look at make sure that in case of a negative assessment by the Commission of an existing High Council of Justice member, then the Commission will send and publish a recommendation for dismissal to the respective appointing authority. So as you can see, this is a quite specific set of measures that the authorities of Ukraine agreed upon, and we will work with them to ensure that by the end of October, these are implemented.
Thank you, Mr. Mathias. Yes, you're right, these are very specific measures, but they have already proved its effectiveness. When we are talking about the engagement of international experts, we see that they succeeded in vetting almost all tainted candidates for the High Anti-Corruption Court. So now we can multiple this success for the vetting of the members of the judicial governance. Now I'd like to pass the floor to Deputy Minister of Justice, Oleksandr Banchuk. I hope everything is good now with the connection. Oleksandr, are you with us? I'm afraid that we still have the same troubles with the sound. Very sad that we cannot discuss these issues with you. We are disappointed that also Minister of Justice couldn't join us, as now he is in the Constitutional Court, which is considered a very important law on lustration, cleaning the government. And we are still expecting to have today a head of legal policy committee from Ukraine's parliament. We would also like to discuss with him this new draft law and what is the parliament's plan regarding this draft, taking into consideration the fact that it was not discussed with our international partners, and it is not something Ukraine agreed and took commitments on. So, but we are very lucky today to have Thomas Markert, member and secretary of the Venice Commission. Venice Commission is a very important body within the Council of Europe, which assess whether the draft legislation adopted by European countries meets European standards. Venice Commission is an independent arbiter, saving checks and balances system in Europe. But in Ukraine, Venice Commission is widely used by dishonest judges as a shield from reasonable attempts to ensure judges' integrity. For example, when we suggest to renew judicial governance, taking into account all this questionable decision taken by the High Council of Justice, and And as Mykhailo already mentioned, we have the majority of judges in the High Council of Justice, and at the same time we have kind of organized judiciary in Ukraine, and they have their own majority in the High Council of Justice. And when it comes to the dismissal of a judge who violated the legislation, High Council of Justice refuses to dismiss him, but it prosecutes independent judges itself. So when we are trying to fix the situation, to scrutiny the integrity of the members of the High Council of Justice, to renew this body, and when we suggest to engage unbiased independent actors to the process, like international experts or civil society representatives, members of the High Council of Justice, judges and their supporters, they all take a European principle of independence of judiciary and say, judges should be elected by judges. No one else can interfere. No one can assess judges' integrity. And this situation, when the Venice Commission was used in manipulations, was also repeated when the law on reform of judicial governance was adopted in autumn. The Venice Commission in December provided its opinion on the law, in which it majorly criticized the provisions with regards to reducing the number of Supreme Court judges and provisions suggesting the new competition for the Supreme Court. But the High Council of Justice and their supporters, they used this opinion in the manipulation that the Venice Commission does not support the renewal of the High Council of Justice and judicial governance at all. And moreover, they stated that the Venice Commission opposes the idea of engagement of international experts and civil society, despite the fact that international experts, we have this success with the creation of the High Anti-Corruption Court. But they just close their eyes and say that Venice Commission is opposed to any of this. So, Mr. Markert, are these true ideas of the Venice Commission? Do you really think that the principle of independence of judiciary prevents us from scrutiny of the integrity of judicial governance?
So, thank you very much, first of all, Halyna and Daria, for inviting me to this very interesting web conference. Of course, I would have preferred to be in Kiev and not to do it from Strasbourg. I think it's the first year that I haven't been to Ukraine for many, many years, and I very much regret this, but that's the situation we have. So let me underline from the outset how important it is to have a non-corrupt judiciary. The European Convention of Human Rights gives to everybody the right to a trial by an independent and impartial tribunal. A corrupt judge cannot be an impartial tribunal, and he or she cannot be independent because, of course, a corrupt judge cannot resist political pressure because it's vulnerable. So it is very important indeed to have judges who are honest and have full integrity. The Venice Commission has recognized this in other countries, also in Ukraine. That's why we have supported the reform in 2015-16. And also we have supported the establishment of the High Anti-Corruption Court. The Venice Commission was asked to give an opinion also on the involvement of international experts in the selection of the judges of the court. I know that many people in Ukraine, many politicians hoped that the Venice Commission would oppose this, but the Venice Commission favored this international involvement. So we have no problem with involving internationals in the selection of members of judicial bodies. Of course, this cannot be a permanent solution. I think the normal situation is that people from the country who know the situation best should take the decisions. But I think the exceptional situation in Ukraine justifies the involvement of internationals in the selection of members of certain judicial or parajudicial bodies. But maybe I would like to introduce a distinction here. One thing is to have internationals as part of a filter. Another thing is to have internationals as decision makers. So I think it is appropriate to have internationals being part of a panel scrutinizing the candidates and saying these candidates have to be excluded, they do not fulfill the requirement of integrity. It would be a different cup of tea if the internationals were deciding who is entering this body. For example, internationals should not designate the members of the High Council of Justice. Of course, this is a bit of a moot question. You have a constitution, and the constitution contains rules on the selection of the members of High Council of Justice, and these rules have to be applied unless you amend the constitution. But from what I heard about the time frame of your agreement with the IMF, the constitution cannot be amended so quickly, so you have to apply the constitutional rules. And I must say, on the one hand, these constitutional rules on paper look quite ideal. I am conscious that in practice they do not work so well in Ukrainian reality, and therefore I think what you should do is to introduce an additional filter in the selection process, for example, that only candidates who have passed scrutiny by such a body can then be elected by the different bodies, by the Congress of Judges, by the lawyers, by the prosecutors, by a parliament, by the president, as members of the High Council of Justice. I think this is a measure the Venice Commission will clearly support.
Thank you, Mr. Markert. And as a member of Public Integrity Council, a civil society body that was created in Ukraine and in 2016, but unfortunately it does not possess any powers with regards to judicial selection or evaluation. What about the engagement of civil society representatives to those kind of filters, like the engagement of international experts? As Ms. Jourova today, she said that European Union is looking forward to the that Ukraine has its own experts who participate in these processes, and of course, unfortunately, we cannot trust corrupt judges with their with full authority on these issues. But we have, on one hand, we have international experts, but we also have civil society, which has already proved its effectiveness in judicial evaluation. What about the engagement of civil society to these processes?
I think in principle, it is good to include civil society in such a process. Of course, there may also be risks. In English, you have the nice abbreviation GONGO, Government Organized Non-Governmental Organizations. So the problem is who chooses the representatives of civil society. If we have civil society representatives, is it guaranteed that people like you who really have expertise and who are really independent will be chosen? Or if this is in the law, is there not the risk that other people will be chosen as representing civil society who maybe represent some different vested interests? So in principle, it's a very good idea, but we have to be very careful how to implement it in practice.
Of course, fully agree with you. It is crucial to prevent any political influence on the process of the appointment of election civil society representatives. So to sum up our discussion, I would say that we now what should we do? We have to renew judicial governance, which is responsible for the situation we have within judiciary, and we know how to do that. We have to introduce additional filters to the procedures of selecting members of judicial governance, and we also have to introduce effective instruments for scrutiny the integrity of existing members of judicial governance, High Council of Justice, High Qualification Commission of Judges. And given we have this successful experience with the international experts engagement, we have civil society engaged to the process. I think that we all agree that this experience should be multiple to the reform of judicial governance of Ukraine. So now we still have 35 minutes left, and I will open questions and answers session. So panelists, if you have questions, and also attendees, if you have questions, just please raise your hands, and we will continue our discussion. And we still, I will just note that we still expect maybe representatives from the Ministry of Justice or the head of parliamentary committee, who just noted me that he has some important negotiations. Maybe they could try to join our discussion, as we still have 30 minutes. So. Do we have questions from the panelists or attendees? Okay, I have one question to Mykhailo Zhernakov. Basically, I wanted to ask this question from Mr. Kostin, head of parliamentary committee, as our discussion is very timely. Yesterday, the president, as I've already told, submitted the draft law to the parliament, and instead of strengthening the law of international experts in the process, instead of introducing effective instruments for cleaning the High Council of Justice, this draft law strengthens the High Council of Justice, which sabotaged the reform in the first place. And for now, as it is not clear how they are planning to move forward with this draft, but taking into account that the initiator of this draft is the president, one may assume that this draft law is gonna be considered and likely to be voted by the parliament. So what can we do having this draft? What are the chances we can maybe somehow amend this draft, or other drafts may be introduced? So what can be done by Ukraine to meet the to implement the commitments it took before the IMF? Mykhailo.
Thank you, Halyna. Since I'm the only panelist that is Ukrainian and also has his microphone working, seem to be the one responding to all the. Obviously, I think it's rather would be the minister or the head of the committee that would address this issue better than I can. But I'll try just to think forward what can be done. Yes, I was also, quite honestly, I was quite disappointed, and as well as my colleagues from the Euro Foundation and other civil society organizations, that the law does not provide for the effective renewal of the High Council of Justice. Neither it has provided or suggested effective measures to select the new members of the High Qualification Commission of Judges. I also think the timing is quite unfortunate, because we just signed the memorandum with the IMF, and then 2 weeks later, the president introduces the it's his signature that is on the memorandum, right, and the prime minister's, and then the president introduces the bill that does not go along with the lines of said memorandum and the agreement with the IMF. So I think obviously there is chance to amend this law in the parliament. Of course, I would like as much as you do to get the idea of the member or the head of the parliamentary committee on that. But I'm pretty sure we would have to hear from them in the upcoming weeks, because the parliament will consider this bill. But I have to say that if we don't amend this bill, if we don't provide for three things, basically: A, the effective renewal of the High Council of Justice; B, the removal of the exceptional authority of the infamous District Administrative Court of Kiev to consider special cases, so-called special cases of the top government decisions of the top government bodies, and three, if we do not guarantee the absolute independence and capability of the High Qualification Commission of Judges, that is now sadly, as the bill suggests, becomes a very dependent kind of part of the High Council of Justice, so to say, a very, very dependent body on the unreformed High Council of Justice. We will not have effective judicial reform. So I'm really looking forward to these amendments in the Rada, but I also am looking forward to the position of the president on the really providing for the effective implementation of the memorandum with the IMF, because again, quite honestly, I don't think without the will of the president and his office, we will have good judicial reform at large, and in particular, the renewal of the High Council of Justice that the memorandum provides for. Thank
you. Forgot that I'm muted. Thank you, Mykhailo. In fact, I cannot even count how many failed judicial reforms we had for the last 6 years. So we all really hope that this time we now received maybe the last chance to make it successful, because we know what should be done, we know how it can be done, and now maybe the most important what is needed, and we lack it, it's some kind of political will. But on the other hand, we have a very strong partner, which is IMF, which also understands that it cannot support, it cannot provide its support to a country which is so unstable, which can in court cancel any reform. So let's hope that this time it will be a success story for Ukraine. And I will make I guess the last try to talk to Oleksandr Banchuk.
Halyna,
oh,
now?
Yes, we do hear you.
Yeah, because all our meeting, excuse me, all our meeting, I am with you. I'm trying to understand and catch all things what you discussed, and thank you for your invitation. And excuse me that our minister has not joined you because again during all day he spent in Constitutional Court, and after these hearings in Constitutional Court, he has to go in other place, and all words from him that sorry that he's not with you, and yeah, and now my
and in fact we are very happy that we can finally hear you. Oleksandr, you have been listening to our discussion, and as we discussed, we know that we have to finally reform judicial governance. The key obstacle. We know how to do that. We have our unique solutions, but we do not see some kind of political will from the president's office. Oleksandr, are you with us? We are trying to connect Oleksandr again, and
Halyna?
Yes,
Halyna?
we hear you.
Yeah. Excuse me, and now are you listening to me? Excuse me.
Yes, we do. We
it's I think it's our enemy of Ukraine and our government. It's first time when microphone doesn't work. Now with connection in ministry some happened, and it's, excuse me, because I'm center of Kyiv, but what happened I don't know.
Explanation. So Oleksandr, my question to you is what is the government plan, and what are you planning to do to implement the commitments that Ukraine taken before the IMF?
Yeah, our plan is our roadmap in this sphere is you mentioned our roadmap with IMF and our memorandum, and we have to go according to this provision of this memorandum, and all this topic on the provision which we have in this memorandum, according to High Council of Judiciary, about this administrative court and disciplinary inspections in the High Council of Judiciary. All this provision we try to implement it our legislation, because it's commitment, it's our duty, like our partner of International Monetary Fund, and I hope that maybe it will be possible to amend this draft law, which President yesterday or day before yesterday sent to Parliament before the second reading with this provision.
Were you engaged? Were the Ministry of Justice engaged in the process of drafting?
No. Any participation, and we don't know about the process of drafting this law. But again, that this duty is also big. How to say, and this duty is duty of government also, and that's why we will propose to parliamentary committee to these amendments to the second reading. If not, if not parliamentary committee agree with this, we during next months we will draft it separate draft law according to this memorandum. All of our this plan, and I hope that the situation could be or can be like with banking law, but this story and this situation with banking law also was very hard, with a lot of interest, but our minister participated in this process of drafting this law, also support this draft law in Parliament before first reading, second reading, and I think it's in the same way we will have this situation maybe.
In any case, this should be done. I mean, the law should be adopted by the end of October.
Yes, I know.
So the autumn will be very hot, taking into account that.
And this part of summer also will be hard, because again that we will see what situation will be with this law and what happened. And if we understand that, for example, that to the second reading it's impossible to the second reading of this law, presidential draft law, it's impossible to. I don't know what will be the reason for not including this provision, which we have in the memorandum in this law. We will start the separate procedure of drafted law.
I think it's a good plan, and
it will be better to have one law with all this provision which we have in our memorandum. And in this law, and to make this step in one step, not to divide these steps in different law, and but again it's till we are on this position in government, we will continue to do this and to implement this our duty.
Yes, of course, one joint draft would be better, but for that scenario happen, we need the existing draft law being withdrawn by the president, but I don't think that he's likely to do that.
Because problem and risks we have if we will have different laws. That, for example, the time of going into force of this law, and if High Council of Judiciary, non-reforming High Council of Judiciary, will receive additional power, and this High Council of Judiciary will not be reformed under the provision which we have with IMF, memorandum with IMF. We have big risks that this reform will go in other ways. That's why it's better to have one law, because we don't know in which way this when this presidential law will go into force, and when our draft law, when this draft will be in parliament and adopted, and which time will be going into force. And this step and this how to say variant of has some risks.
Yes, fully agree with you. And now, finally, I'm opening questions and answers session.
And maybe a little bit that also addition our plan, Halyna, because this law is how to say it's quite important, and the main changes which we will have to do in this year in judiciary. But again, that we have other topic in Ministry of Justice, which this question is connection with judiciary. For example, the enforcement of court decision, the reform of forensic institutes and this profession, the alternative measure of judiciary like arbitration, mediation, and each of these law we now registered in parliament, like we drafted this law and now propose this draft law to parliament, and also we have other initiative in sphere of criminal justice, jury trials. Also, I hope that to the end of this month we will propose this draft law on jury trials to government. That the government will be the to send this law to parliament. And it's this this initiative, this the most important about the High Council of Judiciary and this topic which we have in memorandum. But we also in the same time are working in other issue of judiciary and try to make this judiciary more independent, transparent, and more effective. Yeah.
And with talking about other important issues within judiciary, we have a question from our attendees. And I think that this question is also to you, Oleksandr. Question regarding District Administrative Court of Kiev, which our attendee considers, and we all agree, to be the most corrupt court of Ukraine. So what tangible steps can be taken to curb the power and influence of this court?
Again, that we have the and we noticed this step which we will have with this court, that some type of cases, administrative cases, will transform from this court to Supreme Court, this Cassation Administrative Court, and also again we have this in memorandum, and again maybe we will have one again that in our view maybe we will have one draft law to which include provision of High Council of Judiciary, inspectors of disciplinary inspections in High Council of Judiciary, and also this topic on Administrative Court of Kiev. And but again, in memorandum we have provisions that we to the end of summer we have to to make some discussion. Because again, that which type of cases we have to transform, or how to say it's type of administrative cases, because it's hard to fix this type of administrative cases, and we have to, according to principle of legal certainty, and to count all type of administrative cases which we have, and which will has deal on this first instance in Supreme Court, and then we have it. It's not so easy to, because we are thinking about on it, and yeah.
Yes, and
but again, this topic is in our agenda.
Yes, so the answer is that this unique jurisdiction of the Administrative Court of Kiev, which this court uses to blackmail Ukrainian authorities, it will be just transferred to the Supreme Court. And we have one more question from Francesco Florid to Mr. Zhernakov. So, Mykhailo, do any association of judges exist in Ukraine? What is the level of internal independence of the average Ukrainian judge? Statistically, it was told that vast majority of indictment, up to 95%, are accepted by the courts.
Thank you for a very interesting question. So it has, if I understand it correctly, it has different parts, so I try to address them briefly. One, yes, the associations of judges do exist in Ukraine. There is a thing that is called the Council of Judges of Ukraine, that is a self-governance body that doesn't have a lot of authority, but it sure can represent the judges. But again, it is very important to understand how the judges select their peers to the respective bodies, both the HQCJ and the High Council of Justice, and the above mentioned Council of Judges. I'll just give you one example. It was a couple of years ago, it was the reattestation of the judges, or the primary qualification assessment, as it is called in the law, to see whether, as a part of the 2016 reform, to see whether all the judges in Ukraine, or out of all the judges in Ukraine, who doesn't comply with integrity and professionalism criteria. And one lady judge comes to the commission, sits before them during the interview, and she's asked, "Your Honor, where does your property come from? Because you have 5 apartments downtown Kiev, a huge mansion, and several land plots in Kiev or around, and you could not have earned all these during your career, your professional career as a judge." And she says, "Well, as a student, I came to German Democratic Republic, so East Germany, and she said I picked up berries and did some other job and saved, and they gave us free lunches, so I saved some Deutsche Mark, and I brought them back, and then I saved them, and now I bought all this property with it." And surprisingly enough, or unsurprisingly, considering the circumstances, she's green-lighted by the High Qualification Commission to continue working as a judge, but then she is selected by the judges, by the Congress of Judges, to be a member of the High Council of Justice, and she's now a sitting member of the High Council of Justice. So this is just one example of what kind of people are selected to the High Council of Justice. And then again, the same High Council of Justice is prosecuting the independent judges and is not doing well, is not doing good for generally for the judges who want to be independent. So my point is, in a certain way, judges in Ukraine act against their own interest, or at least against the interest of the honest judges, of the judges who want to do their job well and not be dependent or corrupt or anything like this. So that is why just simply giving the judges to do what they want, we're trying to do this. The Congress of Judges of Ukraine selects the majority of the members of the High Council of Justice, but that doesn't work because in the end, it is predominantly the bad people who get, I have to say this, who do not guarantee, maybe they're good people, but they're not fit for guaranteeing judicial independence. And that is something that is really important for judicial reform here in Ukraine. And the same, sorry, and this is just very quickly, and the same goes with the second part was about the indictments. Yes, another thing that does exist is the criminal cases that are open against the judges, and this is the way to influence them both during through the High Council of Justice, through the disciplinary proceedings, to handpick those judges that do not do what the politicians want them to do, and B is through the prosecution to prosecute them criminally for some cases that can be quite easily opened and prosecuted, as we see recently, and basically to extract what is needed from them. So that is why it's so crucial to really renew the judicial governance bodies. And I here would like to thank you, to thank all the panelists, and to thank the Venice Commission especially for their understanding of the special situation in Ukraine and their opinions on other countries with a similar background, such as Moldova and Albania, where they recognize that countries like Ukraine should be a different approach, and we should avoid, by all means, corporatism, by all means, is my interpretation. But what the Venice Commission says is there should be a balance between the judicial representation and the other parts, non-judicial parts, and especially I would like to thank the Venice Commission for the opinion on the anti-corruption court that also really made the difference on the inclusion of the independent international experts. That is a successor that we now really want to multiply. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mykhailo. So I may say that you've already gave your final remarks. Thank you very much for that too. So we now are only 7 minutes left. So I kindly ask our speakers, Mr. Mathias, Mr. Banchuk, and Mr. Markert, to give their final remarks too on today's discussion. If there's something you wanted to emphasize, to say, so here the floor is yours. Mr. Mathias, please.
Yeah, thank you. Just so thanks for the discussion. It was really interesting. As final remark, I'd like to say that these are difficult reforms. I share the impatience that you display as a civil society, and that's normal. But I also need to say that these reforms take time. They are complex. They are difficult, and I think we can say that there has been very positive outcomes over the past years in Ukraine with the work of the authorities. Just think how it was difficult to establish an independent anti-corruption bureau, to have the asset declaration published, to have the anti-corruption court up and running and now consider being an independent court. This hasn't been done in a day, and I think similarly or even more difficult for the High Council of Justice because of its centrality in the judicial reform work. But we have seen in the past that progress and success has been possible. And we also know that Ukraine has many friends outside. It was very good to hear about the Vice President of the European Commission. It was good to be again with Mr. Markert today. The IMF is working a lot with the World Bank, with the UN, with donors like the US, Canada, the UK, And I think all these efforts and the efforts of the civil society, the efforts of the authorities we are discussing with can really produce a good outcome for the benefit of the Ukrainian public and the Ukrainian economy. Thank you.
Thank you for these messages, Mr. Mathias, and then I'll pass the floor to Mr. Markert.
Thank you very much. Is my microphone on? Can you hear me?
Hear you, yes.
So actually my last words go in exactly the same direction. Indeed, this is a difficult reform. I think on the one hand, there's a need for real change in the judiciary. On the other hand, there's also a need to respect certain constitutional rules, certain international standards, and we have to try to find solutions which reconcile both, and that is not easy and will take time. Secondly, I would also underline the availability of the Venice Commission to assist these reforms. As of now, we have not been consulted on the new draft law, and the Venice Commission would certainly be ready to continue its work on judicial reform with the Ukrainian authorities.
Yeah, thank you very much. We hope this time it won't be the situation when Venice Commission assesses the law after its adoption, and we will still have time to amend the draft law before it is adopted by the Parliament. Thank you very much for your contribution. And Mr. Banchuk, Oleksandr, if you're still with us, we have like 1-2 minutes for your final remarks.
Thank you for your invitation to this meeting, and also thank you for our international partners that your support and that you believe in our success. Maybe you believe quite, or how to say, often than sometimes believe society in our success, and because without your support, this road, these steps will be harder. And also I have, because I'm now in this position from I came from civil society organization, and also it's without the, how to say, to push and force from civil society, it also it will be impossible to make some changes, which we have till right now. We have changes, and it's impossible to say that the situation not changes from revolution of dignity and something like this. But again, the speed of these changes are not well, and we are not happy of the speed of these changes and type of these changes, and that's why with your support, international partners, and also with support from civil society, and we hope that we can change the situation and make these very important steps in this sphere.
Thank you, Oleksandr. It's very good final chart for our discussion. Dear panelists, thank you all for your time. It was very fruitful discussion, and I get that we gave the most important answers to the question I raised at the start of our discussion. Again, thank you again for your time. Have a nice evening. No, Mr. Mathias, have a nice day, as you're in Washington time. So let's hope that the next time we will have this discussion, we will discuss the success story with judicial reform in Ukraine. Hope that the next time we can all meet in Ukraine and talk in person. But now we still have some work and homework to be done. So thank you, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.